In other words, we've been studying these as things developed in David's life. There's a pretty strong history, tradition, that suggests the setting or the context in which the Psalms were written. It's not, and we've tried to make this point continually, it's not an inspired history or tradition, but a fairly well-established tradition among the Jews as to what was going on when this particular psalm was written. And a lot of the ones that we studied at the start were psalms that were written when David had been anointed king, but wasn't king yet, and was being pursued by King Saul. We studied several psalms where he was under that kind of strain and persecution as Saul sought to kill him. We've now chronologically reached a point where he has become king and has assumed the throne, and that is the case here. This morning we want to look at Psalm 60. Psalm 60 is the one that we'll be considering in our study this morning. Let's read it together. O God, thou hast cast us off, thou hast scattered us, thou hast been displeased. O turn thyself to us again. Thou hast made the earth to tremble, thou hast broken it. Heal the breaches thereof, for it shaketh. Thou hast showed thy people hard things, thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment. Thou hast given a banner to them that fear thee, that it may be displayed because of the truth. That thy beloved may be delivered, save with thy right hand, and hear me. God has spoken in his holiness. I will rejoice. I will divide Shechem and mete out the valley of Succoth. Gilead is mine, and Manasseh is mine. Ephraim also is the strength of mine head. Judah is my lawgiver. Moab is my washpot. Over Edom I will cast out my shoe. Philistia triumph. Thou, O God, which hast cast us off, and thou, O God, which dost not go out with our enemies. Give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of men. Through God we shall do valiantly, for he it is that shall tread down our enemies. All right, kind of curious the way this psalm is written, because as we said, we think that this psalm was likely written in the context of David now has ascended to the throne. King Saul is dead. His tormentors, his persecutors, those who were pursuing to kill him, are not doing that anymore. And yet the psalm starts out by talking about the fact it seemed that God was displeased. Verse 1, God, thou hast cast us off. And so we're kind of pressed to make an explanation of that. And I think the proper explanation, some people think that this may have been written subsequent to a particular battle that David fought and maybe wasn't too successful in a particular battle. I'm not of that opinion. I'm of the opinion that what he's probably talking about in these initial verses is during the planet, but the institutions of the earth, the governments, the powers that be are shaken. And I think that's what he's talking about there when he says, the earth trembleth. God had broken it. And so he'd broken down the establishment. The establishment was Saul. Saul and his government were the ones that God was displeased with. And so he shook it. He broke it. And now David is asking for God to rebuild or restore. Tom?
About there. Now here Saul comes in. There's a lot of turmoil going on. Saul fought the and things there. A lot of it came back when the children of Israel came out of Egypt and crossed over into the land of Canaan, and they didn't utterly get rid of everybody in the land. They left some to displease the prior two kings. Then Saul comes into place and he gives some semi-stability to it, but they still fought in their way. And then as Saul's defeated and killed, these people around about him looks for that, break down the power. Let's go in and see what we can take over. David has to come in and unite Israel. How do I unite Israel? I can't do it on my own. I've got to have God do it. God has gone through, these others have come through. And he's going to give me trials to go through and work at it. So there's a lot of things going on physically there, and then with the political situation of that thought of grabbing power once a leader is disposed.
Okay, I think you're right. I think so. There was still, even when David was able to ascend to the throne, there were still Saul's loyalists. Abner was trying to hold out at least a portion of the country. Saul had one remaining son, and Abner, who had been captain of Saul's army, was trying to get that one son to be able to reign. And so it wasn't just a flip of the switch and everything just was perfect for David when he became king. There were still some issues to be worked through. And that almost certainly is in context of this psalm as well. All right. Notice that there's an interesting expression there when he says, "Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment." Again, that's sort of figurative language that we see other places in the scriptures too. In Revelation 14, verse 10, it references the wine of the wrath of God. And I would think this is very similar to that, the wine of astonishment at what God has done. Maybe a good way to think about this is wine is the fruit of the harvest, right? In other words, that's the end product. So you tend your grapevines all year long, even in their dormancy. You do certain things, and then as they're coming back in the springtime, there's a lot of work that you got to do to the specific vines. You're working toward eventually getting a harvest, and the fruit of the harvest is the wine of the crop. And so I think you could look at wine as what you get for what you've done, sort of the fruit of or the consequences of your actions. In hopefully in a lot of cases that would be good. We've done well, we've been faithful, and we reap the consequences of that. But on the other hand, you do evil, you sin, there's a consequence to that too. And so I think probably there at the end of verse 3 when he says, "Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment," it probably is he's made them experience the consequences of the country has experienced the consequence of all the troubles that existed when Saul was king. The wine of astonishment, I was reading after one commentator who suggested, you see a drunk who's staggering and falling over and running into things. And that's maybe sort of the word picture too here. They're staggering under the weight of the consequences of all the bad that has happened during the reign of Saul. And so I think that probably, hopefully we've got that right, that is an expression of dealing with the consequences of everything that had happened. We still do that, right? I mean, that's still the case. If we do well, we are blessed. Good things happen when we do well. We do evil, bad things follow. And so choices have consequences. We often say that, and that's, I think, the situation here. He ends that at verse 4. That initial paragraph ends at verse 4.
Spiritually, and as long as Saul is king, Saul's not looking to God for answers.
Yeah.
But David is.
Yeah.
And now David, I think within the psalm, as you go forward, is striving now to get the people to understand who God is, and more importantly, if we want to continue to win these battles, we're going to have to look to God for the answers, and God gives the increase.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think that's right. Anybody else have a thought here? All right, let's read just a little bit further again. We've already read it once, but let's read again. Verse 5, "That thy beloved may be delivered, save with thy right hand, and hear me." Again, this goes to what Aaron was just saying. He understands that his dependency is upon God. That, Saul wasn't that way. Saul tried to do everything by his own main brute strength and determination. He had departed from God, and God departed from him. David is just the absolute opposite of that. He's expressing all his trust and confidence in God as the deliverer. clearly, I think there's a lesson for us in that. The only way we will succeed in our lives is if we put our trust and hope and faith in God and do His will as He has revealed it to us. Verse 6, God has spoken in His holiness, I will rejoice, I will... Now, we'll stop there for a minute. Again, that's still in that same vein of putting trust in. God has spoken in His holiness, I will rejoice. Are we glad to know what God wants us to know? In other words, God has spoken, I will rejoice. So, do I really rejoice in what God has said, or I'm kind of unhappy because some of the things that God has asked me to do is not what I really want to do, you know? He's told me to be honest. I'm in the Walmart store, and I'd sure like to take that little electronic gadget and stick it in my pocket and get out of here because I think I could. But God has spoken, I will rejoice. I'm glad that God has told me, don't do that. So we should rejoice in God's instruction to us when it's things that we would have probably normally done anyway, when it's things that we probably wouldn't have done, left to our own discretion. But God has spoken in His holiness, I will rejoice. I think that's a worthy principle to consider. Anybody have on that? Tom?
There in verse 5, he says that you're beloved. But David's not saying that I do. He puts it in that context that, you're beloved. So it puts it, as long as I'm doing what you're saying, I'm your beloved. But I realize that if I don't, I'm not your beloved.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a clarifier there to, who he's going to serve when he's right in.
Yeah. I think it's significant. I'm glad you brought that up, Tom. I think it's significant that even though the country had been experiencing some harsh realities at the end of Saul's reign, there were still those among the people who were beloved of God. This sort of reminds me of some of the statements in the book of Revelation where in some of the churches, they were in bad shape, but there were still some who had not soiled their garments. Remember when we studied recently the letters to the 7 churches. Even in some of the bad churches, there were still some people who were standing for what was right and being faithful. And so even when times are bad, we got to be faithful, and God recognizes His faithful ones even in bad times. So, this is kind of, I was thinking in reading this, there are some people, and we've known them, we unfortunately it's always been the case, there are some people who go whichever way the wind blows, whatever is trending popular at the moment, they go with that. Whatever will keep them in a favorable situation, whichever way the wind blows. If you had been in Israel under the reign of King Saul, at least initially when he was pursuing David, you would want to have been on Saul's side because Saul certainly had the upper hand in that scenario initially. And if you were just going to go the way the wind is blowing, you would have gone with Saul. But obviously that wasn't God's will, and that wasn't what should have been so. And so the faithful ones would have been true no matter what. And I think there's an application of that to us in the world today. We don't always take the popular stand. In fact, very often we take an unpopular stand as the people of God. But God loves us when we do what's right and stand for what is right. Anybody have a thought here? Any comment? Monty?
When you think about it, up here where it talks about, in verse 3 it says, you've made us drink the wine of confusion, it says in the New King James. And you go down here and he talks about that. They were confused at this point. Saul was dead, David had taken over the kingship, but there's still, as you mentioned, the loyalist movement to Saul's son. And so people are, where do I need to go? What do I need to do? I don't know what to do. But then he says, all right, now I've provided you a banner. I've identified who I want.
Yeah.
You need to be loyal and be part of that beloved as the nation of God, return back to God. And then I'll bless you if you follow that banner.
Good point. And I think right along with that is the first phrase of verse 6 too. God has spoken. I mean, God's will is known in this matter. David is to be king, and so I think that's exactly right. That God had made known what He wanted, and He was blessing those who were going with what He wanted. All right, there's an interesting section then begins there in the middle of verse 6, and it mentions several places. And I want you to think about the geography of it just for a minute. Sort of picture in your mind. He says, I will divide Shechem. So Shechem would have been in the western part of the land of Canaan. And then he says, mete out the valley of Succoth. Succoth would have been in the eastern part of the land of Canaan. So west and east. Manasseh, Gilead is mine, and Manasseh, those would have been the regions east of the Jordan River. Ephraim, he mentions, which is the northern part of the kingdom. Judah, of course, was the south and the ruling tribe. David was of Judah. So west, east, north, south. Notice, what's he describing here? It's sort of all-encompassing, right? Everything, all of it, is being blessed by God in regards to David and his reign and the encouragement to the people to submit to that. Then he mentions some of the enemies. Moab is my wash pot. What's the imagery there? Moab is my wash pot. Well, I think the imagery is a wash pot is your least favored vessel in the house. You know, so you might have you ladies might have a china plate or a dish or a bowl that's precious china, and you only use it for special circumstances. You don't use that to wash your dirty dishes. You've got an old beat up metal pan maybe that you use to wash your dishes. It's not, you don't place great value on it. It's usable, but you don't place great value on it. It's not like a favored heirloom dish in your cupboard. And so I think that's the imagery there. Moab, of course, Moab had been perpetual enemies of Israel. So what's God going to do to them now? They're going to be like a disregarded wash pot. Over Edom I will cast out my shoe. I've always liked that expression. Over Edom I will cast out my shoe. So you're out, you're working, you're walking, and you get some dirt or gravel, stones in your shoe, and you take it off and you just dump it out. You don't dump out your shoe in the middle of the living room, right? If you do, your wife is going to tell you about that for sure. You dump out your shoe where it doesn't matter. You don't care, right? And I think that's the expression here where he says, over Edom I will cast out my shoe. Now, the King James Version, I think, is not good here at the end of verse 8. Philistia, triumph thou because of me. The King James makes it sound like he's calling upon Philistia to succeed and triumph. And that's not the meaning there. The English Standard Version, for instance, says, over Philistia I shout in triumph. So he's included regions west and east and north and south. God's reign and rule through David will exist. And the enemies, and he mentions specifically Moab and Edom and Philistia, who were perpetual enemies of Israel. They're going to be brought into submission under the reign of David. They're going to suffer as David comes to power. And David eventually did. David conquered all the existing lands around there. When David died and the kingdom was passed on to Solomon, Solomon had peace. Solomon didn't have to fight wars. He was able to really build up. Jerusalem, build the temple, and all that was involved with the reign of Solomon and the prosperity and wealth. He inherited that from David. David had fought all those enemies and brought them into submission, and that's sort of what is being predicted here. There were some prophecies made in this regard. I want you to go back with me, Numbers 24. In Numbers 24, this is where Balak was trying to get Balaam to curse Israel. Remember, as Israel was coming up toward the promised land, and Balak wanted to hire Balaam to curse them so that they would not take over his country. But Balaam wasn't allowed to curse Israel. Instead, he blessed them and prophesied of their good. In Numbers 24, verse 3, he took up this parable and said, Balaam the son of Beor hath said, the man whose eyes are open hath said, he has said, which heard the words of God, which saw the vision of the Almighty, falling into a trance, but having his eyes open. How godly are thy tents, O Jacob, and thy tabernacles, O Israel. As the valleys are they spread forth, as gardens by the riverside, as the trees of lean aloes which the Lord hath planted, and as cedar trees beside the waters. He shall pour the water out of his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters, and his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. And so on it goes. So, it had been prophetically promised that God was going to bless them in the ways that he had and was as David came to power. God blesses those who do right. That's just an eternal principle, and he's going to bless Israel with David as their king. Anybody else have a thought here? Anybody see anything? Yeah, Clayton.
Back to the casting the shoe at Edom. In a lot of cultures in the world, especially Asia, it's an insult to throw a shoe at somebody.
Yeah.
And then all three of these are actually mentioned again in Psalm 108, verse 9. Oh, I lift my washpot over Edom, I'll cast my shoe over Philistia, I will try. I don't know if that's where it originated from or not, but sometimes you'll see a politician get a shoe tossed at him.
Yeah. We don't have that in our culture so much, but in other cultures and other parts of the world, there is significance. I remember when we were in Russia, if you sat with your legs crossed and showed the sole of your shoe, that was considered an insult, to show people the sole of your shoe. You didn't sit that way. In fact, they would stop. I remember being on a subway train, and one of the guys with us sat with his legs crossed, and the sole of his shoe was exposed. One of the Russians came and flipped his leg, flipped it off his knee so that he wouldn't be showing the sole of his shoe. It's an insult. And I think that's what's intended here. God's going to insult the enemies of Israel. Anybody else have a thought? Okay. So at verse 9, who will bring me into the strong city? Who will lead me into Edom? Wilt not thou, O God, which hast cast us off? And thou, O God, which didst not go out with our enemies, or with our armies, with our armies. So, look at verse 9. David is asking, who's going to make all good things happen? Who's going to bring us into the strong city? Who's going to bring us into Edom, lead us into Edom? God will. God's going to bless us. God's going to make us succeed over our enemies. But he had, notice, verse 10, wilt not thou, O God, which hast cast us off, past tense. They were not in a good relationship with God under King Saul. And God, which did not go out with our armies, God had not gone out with the armies of Israel under Saul. And as we said earlier, that was most manifest in the very fact that Saul was killed in battle. That's how it ended for Saul. And so David is saying the only way we're going to get better here is because of God. Tom?
Who will lead me into the besieged city? The concept of war at that time was you surround the city, you basically start it out, and when you've conquered it, the leader goes in and basically takes the city. Somebody's got to lead you there. You just don't go into a strong and the other is, well, a strong city. You can't get in until you besiege it and you overpower it. God's the one that's overpowered it, and he leads him in unopposed.
Yeah.
Where if you try to go into a strong fortified city, you're going to be opposed going in, and you're going to have attachments. Here, God's done the besieging. He's going in. You're walking in as a conqueror.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's the meaning of bring me into the strong city. So there's some enemies out there that are pretty strong. They got fortified cities. Who's going to help me take them? God. Exactly right. Other thoughts here, anybody? All right. Then he says in verse 11, give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. Through God we shall do valiantly, for he it is that shall tread down our enemies. And so the psalm ends with an expression of trust in God to provide for them the help that they need, help from trouble. I think verse 11 is pretty applicable. We need to probably soak that in pretty good, because we're not fighting, we're not fighting physical wars. We're not in hand-to-hand combat with some, physical enemy who's confronting us. But we have troubles, right? Give us help from our trouble, for vain is the help of man. In other words, men can't do it. There's not any man I can turn to who's going to help me in the face of trouble. Only God. And that's what David is expressing there. Through God we shall do valiantly. He will tread down our enemies. I think that's still pretty applicable in our situation today. I mean, but as Aaron said earlier, we're fighting a spiritual battle, not a physical battle. But the fact of the matter still is, we got to lean on God. The help of man is vain. There's a lot of human wisdom that if you were going through some particular trial in your life, you could go out and you could seek some counselors who would counsel you with human wisdom. For instance, I'll just use this as an example. Here's a guy, and his marriage is in trouble. Him and his wife it's just not happening at all. They're just not getting along in any shape. He goes to a human counselor, and the human counselor says, he says, you just need to get out of that marriage. You just need to leave her, because you got to do whatever you got to do to make you happy. And that's the way human counselors typically counsel, right? And so there's the help of man. That's not going to help the situation. The vain is the help of man. You can sort of contrast that with, I heard a story years ago, and we've talked about this, used this illustration before. So this guy goes to an elder or a preacher and says, I don't love my wife anymore. I just don't love her anymore. And so the old elder says, he says, there's really only one thing you can do. And the guy sort of perks up, he thinks he's going to tell him he can leave that wife and get him another one. But the elder proceeds to say, there's only one thing you can do. You need to repent and start loving her again. That's godly counsel, right? Versus the counsel of men. And so I think this expression, the vain is the help of man. If man is just giving advice and instruction based upon human wisdom, that's not going to help. We got to trust in God. Through God we shall do valiantly. Aaron?
So I think it goes back to the context that we there in the verses ahead of it that we've already talked about the banner. So where do you find yourself? You have to find yourself in the banner of truth, justice, and righteousness. Who has that banner? God. And so to be in truth, justice, and righteousness, you have to be flying that banner of truth. Come back to that banner of truth, which is God. I think that's what's leading here in this psalm, is fly that banner of truth that you can only find in God, in which you will be victorious. And how much symbolism then is there for us as Christians, as you were talking about, is it goes back to truth is truth, and that does not change. And we must be strong to continue to weigh that banner of truth, even if it means that we've got to change what we're doing.
Yeah, good point, good point. James?
I think that's exactly right. And he quotes God, saying, God is always the same. He says, I know the people that's mine. I know Israel. I know my possession. I know my people. And I know my enemies. So you've got to choose which side you're going to be on. Are you going to be my people and be in truth? Or are you going to be my enemies, like Saul was, even though he was physically the children of Israel? He chose the wrong way. And the very beginning of the psalm, it says, of David to teach. So David is trying to teach us the experiences of Israel, so we want to repeat them in our lives.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Herman, did you have a thought?
It's not in man to direct his own steps.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Jeremiah 10:23. It's not in man to direct his own steps. You know, we make a pretty big mess of things when we try just to do it in our own way, and we got to have confidence to do it in God's way. JD.
Yeah, this is exactly something I was just thinking about David. That's usually when he did make mistakes. It's when he, relied on his own reasoning and went off the wrong way. But, here would have been an opportunity for him to have, especially when you're talking about, one of his main enemies, the Philistines. He had actually fought with them, or at least for the, king of Gath, who was part of the Philistines. So kind of like today, we might talk about a football player who joins a rival team. Oh, this is great because he knows all about the inner workings of their playbook and their team. He's really going to help us beat them. David could have really touted his experience with, I've been fighting him for years, plus I even fought with him. So, me as king, we're really going to take it to him.
I'm the one, by the way, who killed Goliath. I can do some pretty amazing things just by my own strength. Yeah, I think you're right. Tom?
You think back to Israel a lot of times. God never used the might of men to do things. He always showed them that. When the children of Israel coming out and they're fighting against different enemies, Joshua then had to hold up Moses' arms. It was God that was winning the battle. You think about Nebuchadnezzar, his boastfulness and everything, how God brought him down. Think about Hezekiah. He locked up in here. The king of Syria comes down, surrounds the city, just thinks he's going to overpower. God delivered. God's the one that always delivers. Man, whenever he tries to deliver, he messes up. How many times do we have, in history where we see some military leader that went in and got puffed up about what he was doing and went in to do something and failed at it. And you can just go through history, Napoleon and, Genghis Khan and all these others. They just, they went through, they said they'd do it, but when they tried to do it on their own, they failed.
Okay. All right. So I think the takeaway of this psalm, like several of the others that we've studied, is trust God. Do God's things God's way. That does not mean, I guess we should probably end on this note, that does not mean, and we wouldn't want to leave anybody with the impression that we're teaching sort of a health and wealth gospel here. If you serve God, nothing ever bad is going to happen to you in this life. You'll be healthy and wealthy and everything will be perfect and you won't have any problems or troubles or issues. We're not saying that, right? Because that's a carnal outlook on reality. If we're just saying this means that our physical life will go well without exception, that's the wrong conclusion. Now, I do think I think we live a better life and we are spared from lots of trouble in our physical life when we live the way God wants us to live. But there's exceptions to that. There are good people who suffer horribly in this world. Jesus Christ is the ultimate example of that, a perfect person. Look at the things that he suffered. So we don't want to leave the impression that we're saying your physical existence on earth will be without any issues at all if you live for God. That's just not the case. But spiritually, it's a perfectly true statement. And if we live for God spiritually, nothing can assail us. We'll have it all. Wait.
So usually around February, so I like to put out seeds for my plants.
And those plants will grow and they'll get about so high. But if I take those plants and just put them out in the garden, they'll die. I have to stress those plants. I've got to put them out in the wind, in kind of do it easily and give them something to stress them. And I think God does us the same way. I think He tries us. He puts us to trials. And as we grow, we become a better person.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that illustration before. That's an interesting illustration. But we are. I mean, we are going to be tried in this life. We're going to, and it's not going to end as long as we live here. We're going to make the point in the sermon. You know, we're going to talk about temptation and facing temptation. We're going to face temptation as long as we live in this world. And so we don't want to leave the impression we're saying it's all just a perfect bowl of cherries, so to speak, if you live for God. Not in this physical world, but spiritually it is always true. All right, we're almost out of time. We've got a few extra minutes, but appreciate all the good comments this morning. Lord willing, next week our psalm will be Psalm 51, which I think we all recognize. Psalm 51, David dealing with his sin in that psalm. All right.